Well, hey guys, welcome. Come on in. And we've got all the essentials back there: granola bars and cookies and tea. This is oak baked, so we've got like 50 varieties of tea, and most of it is non-decaf. So there's that. But so excited to welcome you tonight. It's exciting to. Excited to worship together. And we've said this before, you can worship alone, and that's great. And you've got that ability to worship God on your own, but there's something about coming together with others. And so I hope tonight that wherever you are coming from, whatever kind of week you've had, whatever things you're wrestling with in your life, difficult things, or if you're coming in with a bunch of joy, I hope that you share that joy with us, and I hope also that you share those burdens with us, that we can walk through life together. And so you came on a good night. We're going to kick off a new teaching series tonight. But before we get into any of that, let's pray together, and then these guys are going to lead us in some music. And God, we're thankful. We thank you for who you are, and we thank you that we can come here tonight. And no matter what kind of week we've had, we have something to be thankful for. You've given us another day. You've given us breath in our lungs. And so as we've sung before, God, we plan to use that breath tonight to give you worship and to give you praise. And so wherever we are on that journey, God, I pray that you would meet with us here tonight, and that we would have an encounter with you that would change us, that we might leave this place different than how we came in. And so, God, would you be pleased by what happens here tonight? We pray in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. So if you're able to, I invite you to stand up as we begin the worship here tonight.
I was buried beneath my shame. Who could carry that kind of weight? It was not true till I met you. I was breathing but not alive. good in me. You are love, you are love, on display for all to see. You are light, when the darkness closes in. You are hope, you have covered all my sin. You are peace, when my fear is crippling. You are true, even in my wandering. You are joy, the reason that I sing. You are life, in you death has lost its sting. And Lord, I'm running to your arms, I'm running to your arms. The riches of your love will always be enough. Nothing compares to your embrace. Light of the world, forever reign. You are more than my words will ever say. You are Lord, all creation will proclaim. You are here, in your presence I'm made whole. You are God, above all else I'm letting go. Lord, I'm running to your arms, I'm running to your arms. The riches of your love will always be enough. Nothing compares to your embrace. Light of the world, forever reign. My heart will sing. My heart will sing. No other name. Jesus, my heart will sing. No other name. Jesus, my heart will sing. No other name. Jesus, my heart will sing. No other name. Jesus. I'm running to your arms, I'm running to your arms. The riches of your love will always be enough. Nothing compares to your embrace. Light of the world, I'm running to your arms, I'm running to your arms. The riches of your love will always be enough. Nothing compares to your embrace. Light of the world, forever reign. My heart will sing. My heart will sing. No other name. Jesus, my heart will sing. No other name. Jesus, one time, my heart will sing. No other name. Jesus, my heart will sing. No other name.
God. Would you just be the person that we run to? With whatever we have, Father, we're never beyond a point that you can reach, Lord. So I pray, whatever battles we're facing, whatever struggles we have, you would be the one that we run to.
Worthy is the Lamb who was slain. Holy, holy is He. Sing a new song to Him who sits on heaven's mercy seat. Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty, who was and is to come. With all creation I sing praise to the King of Kings. You are my everything, and I will adore you. Clothed in rainbows of living color, flashes of lightning, rolls of thunder. Blessing and honor, strength and glory and power be to the only wise King. Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty, who was and is to come. With all creation I sing praise to the King of Kings. You are my everything, and I will adore you. Filled with wonder, awestruck wonder, at the mention of your name. Jesus, your name is power, breath and living water, such a marvelous mystery. Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty, who was and is to come. With all creation I sing praise to the King of Kings. You are my everything, and I will adore you. Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty, who was and is to come. With all creation I sing praise to the King of Kings. You are my everything, and I will adore you.
Father God, thank you that we're able to just join together with each other in worship, Lord. And as we sing these songs, we're joining in with just other
Bible is the most influential and highest selling book of all time. And yet, most people only know it in little pieces. A verse here, a story there. Jesus changed the world. But if we are to fully understand the significance of his life, what he did, then we need to understand the story that comes before. Jesus himself said that he is the fulfillment of everything in the Old Testament. And so you want to join us at Canvas Church as we start a new teaching series where we will dive into that incredible history and discover how we are part of a much bigger story.
A new teaching series tonight called Part of a Bigger Story. And I'm excited because hopefully over the next, I don't even know how long it's going to be, several weeks, we're gonna dive into the Old Testament and look at the grand narrative of Scripture. Not just, little pieces here, little pieces there, but say, hey, let's go back to the beginning and let's see how this whole thing ties together and how it all points to Jesus. A unified story, all pointing to Jesus. And the really cool part of that is that the story's not over yet. We're part of that. And so as we come to discover this grand narrative, we'll also discover that we're part of that. And so I'm excited to dive into this. Why is it valuable to understand the Old Testament? Right? It's like, man, there's a lot in the Old Testament, and sometimes we read things in the Old Testament, we're like, well, that's odd, or I'm not sure what's going on in there, or is there like, wow, that's violent, things like that. And so we're going to dive in. Here's why I think it's valuable. There was a woman in France recently who had this picture hanging in her kitchen, really right above like a heating stove area where she cooked, and it had been in her family for so long that nobody ever really remembered how it even got there. They didn't really know the history of this piece of art. It was just kind of with this lady forever. Well, she got up into her 90s and was going to move out of that place, and so they brought someone over to kind of appraise the value of all of her stuff. She didn't need all of her stuff. She was going to sell off some of it, see what value she could get. And the guy who came to do that sees this painting and was like, like painting on wood, like that looks pretty old. It's a painting of the story of Jesus, story of his crucifixion, and says, I'm going to take this to an art expert and see if they can figure out if there's any value in this painting. They had appraised all of her other things and came to about $6,000. And they're like, well, maybe we can get some money for this painting. Well, when the auctioneer brought it to the art expert, the expert realized that it was a 13th century painting, and I'm going to get this name wrong, by, it's Cimabue. Cimabue? It doesn't sound like a legit painter, but apparently he was the guy who taught Giotto. And this painting was one of several. The rest have been lost, I believe. But any guesses on how much this sold for? Any guesses? 4 million? What do you think, Macy? What would you pay for that painting? 4 million, 6 million? How about $27 million? for this 13th century rare painting, been hanging in her kitchen for years. Had no idea she was like cooking right underneath of this thing, a thing of immense value. You see, when we understand the backstory of something, oftentimes we will better understand its current value. Sometimes we can take a look at something, and I think we can even look at Jesus. Maybe it's a painting of Jesus in this circumstance. Sometimes I think we can look at Jesus and not get a full picture of the value of who he is, what he taught, what he did, the significance of all of that, unless we know some of the backstory. Because then we come to have a better understanding of this thing of immense value that maybe we didn't see before. And so I'm hoping that throughout this journey over the next few months, that we won't just get head knowledge. You're going to get some head knowledge tonight, but that is with a purpose in mind. The purpose being to grow us closer, not just in our understanding, but in our love for who Jesus is. And so let's go to the very beginning. So if you have a Bible with you, just go all the way to where it starts. Genesis 1:1. Now, we're not gonna tackle every verse of the Old Testament. Obviously, we're gonna hit the sort of the big narrative moments that move things forward. But let me just start with these. These are the first two verses of the Old Testament of the Bible. It says, "In the beginning." We could probably park there for the whole evening, saying that in the beginning, at the beginning of all things, there was somebody, right? It's not saying, hey, this was already going on, and this is saying, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That's like a summary statement of all of this. And in the beginning, there was God, and God was responsible for, and heavens and earth is just a phrase, it's a Hebrew phrase to mean all of it. It says, in the beginning, God created all of it. It says, the earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. And so we're gonna camp out on these two verses for a little bit tonight, because there's a lot in there. Now, these verses have been the cause of much debate over the years, as well as the verses that come after. It is my goal in this series, especially tonight, and especially in these beginning verses and beginning chapters of Genesis, not to chase all the different rabbits that are available to chase. So if you took a look at the recommended reading table, might have gone a little overboard tonight. But for all of you guys who are like, man, I would like to chase that rabbit, I want to know more about that, or I'd like to hear this perspective, I've provided lots of resources back there, so and a little sticky note to kind of say what perspective it gives, right? I'm going to give you a perspective tonight, but there's other ones out there, and so if you're interested, I'll take Sarah's you should take a picture of these recommended things and put them on the Facebook page or something. So I will also do that, because that's a great idea. But there's going to be a bunch of things we could talk about, and so we're going to try and focus on just a few of those things tonight, because there's a lot of different interpretations, especially when you get into these beginning things of Genesis. We need to be clear right off the bat what the author is and what the author isn't addressing. Right? A lot of the debate that goes into some of these verses are oftentimes debates about things that perhaps the author was never even trying to address. Oftentimes, when you get into some of the minutiae of the scientific debate, people will say, well, what about this? What about that? And you can see this, and you can see that, and we have to read this, and this is hard, but when we come to the Bible, we all come with a certain lens that we're looking through. And our lens is going to be as 21st century, post-Enlightenment, post-scientific revolution Westerners. That is not who wrote this, right? And so we're going to come wearing a different lens than the people than the authors of these books that we're going to get into in the Old Testament. And so what we got to do is say, okay, so when this was written, what were they trying to address? What were what were they concerned about? And so what would a Hebrew author's main focus be? Let me give you a scenario. So imagine you walk into our house. I'm having trouble with the connection here, Becca. Put that kettle picture up there. Say you walk into our house and you see a kettle on the stove. And it looks like that. There's steam coming out of it. And you ask the question, why is the kettle boiling? You come in, it's a valid question. Why is the kettle boiling? Well, there's a couple answers to that question. One answer is heat has made the H2O molecules move quickly and turn into vapor. The second answer is my wife put on the kettle to make me a cup of tea because she loves me. Both, yeah. Both answers are right. They both answer the question from a different angle. And what we find is that the Hebrew author of Genesis is primarily focusing on that second perspective. It is not necessarily trying to answer every scientific question that we come to the text with, right? Oftentimes the questions that we come with are because those are questions that we have. But those aren't necessarily the questions that the original audience of this text was asking. Now that doesn't mean that when the Old Testament, when Scripture speaks to these things, that it speaks incorrectly or that it's false, right? We believe that the Bible speaks truth to these things, but it does mean that if we come to the Bible expecting it to answer questions that it's not trying to answer, then oftentimes that can be a dangerous road. And that's where a lot of miscommunication can happen, where we're trying to read things into the Bible that aren't there and try to pull things out of the Bible that it's not really trying to say. And so both of those explanations of the kettle are true, but they just come at one sort of the scientific, like what's the mechanics of what's happening, and the other one is dealing with the relational side of it. Why is this happening? What's the purpose and meaning behind this? And so there's a guy that I'm going to give you one perspective tonight by a guy named John Walton. He's a Hebrew professor, and he has an interesting way of looking at the text from that second angle, where he says that the ancient Hebrews were concerned primarily about function and purpose. And so when they looked at the cosmos, they weren't necessarily trying to ask all these questions of like what's the sun made out of, and how did the stars come to be formed physically, and all these things. When they looked at the cosmos, they were primarily asking, like, what's the purpose of all of this? Like, why is all of this here? Actually, a great question that we still ask today, like, why is there something rather than nothing? It's not that all of this has to be here, right? We look around and we don't say, well, yeah, of course all of this is here. Like, it couldn't have been any other way. We say, why is there something rather than nothing? It begins with God and culminates in humanity. So as you go through those first few verses of Genesis, it starts with God. It says, in the beginning there was God. And then God sets up this universe, this world, and then at the peak of all of that, you see humanity. Sort of at the end of all this creation, you see humanity. And you have to ask yourself, okay, so why is it set up that way? Why is the author saying, okay, so you've got God setting all of this up, and it points to humanity, and then Genesis 3, we'll get to all of this in the weeks to come, you have the fall, the severing of that relationship between God and humanity. And you have to read Genesis 1 in light of Genesis 3. You say, if all of this is telling the story of how God and humanity were once created to be in relationship with each other, and that was severed at Genesis 3, and all of this stuff sort of derailed and fell apart, and the rest of the Old Testament is about God restoring that relationship with his people and with the world, then that should impact the way that we look at Genesis 1. Why is it telling us that God is setting all of this up? Is it just for curious minds to be like, where did all this stuff come from? Because the Hebrews believed that God created it all, right? That summary statement was not going to really be argued by them. It was like, well, yeah, God created this stuff. What they were interested in is the purpose of why this stuff is here. And so what Walton sees is he's like, you actually see in this creation account the setting up of like a cosmic temple. he says it's got a lot of similarities to when you look at God later on in the Old Testament setting up a temple. And he says what you see in this is God actually setting up the universe for a purpose, for worship. And at the end of this creation, he puts people into this. And actually at the end of all of that, you've got God resting on the Sabbath. And after the end of all of this, you have God resting on the seventh day. A temple is a place where God's presence resides and where he is worshipped. God is declaring purpose over his creation. Let me give you an example of what that might mean. In the Hebrew mindset, to look at something like that would be, well, that's just a hunk of wood. It's just pieces of wood put together, but it doesn't really, quote, exist yet, because it has no purpose, right? You look at that and you'd be like, well, it's just a hunk of wood. But then somebody comes and says, but I declare that the purpose of this hunk of wood is to be a chair. It is designed for that purpose. It's not designed to to do this or to do that. What it's designed to do is for a person to be able to sit on that above the ground, to be able to lean and not fall off of that. And the way this thing is put together is actually to serve a purpose. And what Walton sees going on in Genesis is that God is setting up this universe to serve the purpose of a temple. That all of this exists for his worship. That when things do what they were created to do, then that gives glory to God. And all throughout the book of Psalms, it says, you can see all these things giving glory to God. That the created order, when you look, and you can see this in Victoria, right? You look out at the mountains and you're brought to this awe, and you're just like, it's like the mountains are worshiping their creator. And you see the water, and you're brought to this sense of awe, because all of this stuff is created, is designed to point towards its creator. Now, this does not mean that God didn't also physically bring these things into existence, right? There's a bunch of verses that speak to that. And so if you want to look up some verses that speak towards, God made this stuff, God physically brought things into existence, there's lots in the Bible that points to that. But what Walton is saying, and what this perspective is as you go through Genesis, what you see is God setting things up for a purpose, and that purpose will become clear later on. The difference really is between building and moving furniture into a house, and then deciding what those rooms will serve, right? If you've moved into a new house, you kind of have all the stuff. There's that level of it. Okay, we got, the beds here. We got our kitchen stuff in here. We got these things. And really, you're just saying, this is where all the stuff is. But then you decide, so what is the purpose of these rooms? So you sort of move the furniture around. That's one side of it. But then you say, and the room with the bed, that's going to be our bedroom. The room with the kitchen, that's where we're going to cook meals. This dining room, that's where we're going to come together and eat. And the purpose of these rooms are really what make the house a home. And Walton's perspective is that what you read in Genesis is more so talking about God making the universe a home rather than physically building the house. And so what that means is that how God did that, how God built the house, is still a great question, but it may not be the primary question that Genesis is aimed at right here, rather than saying this is what God has done. And so when you look actually at the tabernacle passage in Exodus, you can start to see some similarities. So the first few verses, it's basically saying this is how they set up the tabernacle to function as sort of this portable place of worship while the Israelites are in the desert. And then it says, and he erected the court around the tabernacle and the altar and set up the screen of the gate of the court. So Moses finished the work, and then the cloud covered the tent of meeting, that's this holy place, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. And so what you have is Moses is sort of setting everything up, saying this is how all of this is meant to function. And when all of that is done, when all these different things in the tabernacle have their purpose, it says God enters into that place. And now you begin to worship. And so when you look at these 7 days of creation, you see the universe is being set up man, like things are being given this is what, you've got the sea and the land, and you've got the sea animals, and you've got these land animals, and you've got all these things, and when they do what they were created to do, they give glory to their creator. And then on the seventh day, it says, and God rested from his labor. Now, talking about that is more than just, okay, so like, because we know God didn't get tired. It's not like God was like, woo, like that was a lot of work. Like I need to put my feet up for a little bit. It's bigger than that. Walden says it's pointing to something like this. It's saying, now that this cosmic temple is set up, I will reside in this place, and my people will come to worship me, and that will continue on. And so it's not this sense of like on the seventh day God rested, and then like what about the eighth day? Like what did God do on the eighth day? It's this continual thing of God entering into really setting up his creation in such a way that it will worship him and to go from there. So as nature does what it was designed to do, it serves its purpose and it worships God. And we serve our purpose when we come to worship God as well. And so we'll talk next week more about the part that we play in that when it comes to how God creates us in his image. But why has Genesis been so controversial? Right? Why, when we come to these few verses and the ones that come after, why has this been so controversial in history? Sort of this battle oftentimes that people say between science and faith, and primarily it's been more of a controversy of worldviews. Not so much, there are these things in Scripture where people are like, well, I don't know if that lines up scientifically with what we know now and that sort of thing. And so there are those debates, but I think primarily it's a worldview debate. It's a philosophy debate between whether we believe that there's more out there, that there's a God out there who gave purpose to all of this, who brought this stuff into existence, or whether we look out there and say, there's nothing out there. And so how do these origin stories differ? One guy who saw it as not having a God, Bertrand Russell, a famous atheist, philosopher, a mathematician, who looked at the universe, and this is kind of a chewy quote, so I'll explain it in just a minute, but this is what he says. He says that man is the product of causes which had no provision of the end they were achieving. So he's like we're just kind of an accident at the end of this long process that wasn't trying to create us. We just kind of appeared at the end of this process. That his origin, his growth, origin, by the way, Genesis just literally means beginning. They just sort of take the first words out of the first sentence to name the book. So that's what we're talking about. It says that his growth, his hopes and fears, his loves, his beliefs are but the outcome of accidental collocations of atoms. So he's saying like the things that your brain's doing, they're just sort of doing that. And there's no purpose behind it. Your atoms are just doing what they're doing, and you're just sort of along for the ride. And it says that no fire, no heroism, no intensity of thought and feeling can preserve an individual life beyond the grave. He says once you die, that's it. There's nothing beyond that. That all the labors of the ages. So now he's not just talking about individual life. He's saying everything that has happened in history, all the labor of the ages, all the devotion, all the inspiration. Think of the art, the architecture, all of these things that humanity has done, all the noonday brightness of human genius. You think of the inventions, he says, are destined to extinction in the vast death of the solar system. He's saying eventually all the stuff that we do is just going to be done. He says in the whole temple of man's achievement, even he sort of looks at the universe as a sort of temple. This temple of man's achievement must inevitably be buried beneath the debris of a universe in ruin. He says, as our sun starts to cool down, and all the other stars start to cool down, and eventually when this universe goes cold, he says, all we have is a debris of universe in ruin. All these things, if not quite beyond dispute, are yet so nearly certain that no philosophy which rejects them can hope to stand. He's saying if you don't believe this, then your worldview, your philosophy is not going to stand, because this stuff is pretty certain. Only within the scaffolding of these truths, Only on the firm foundation of the unyielding despair can the soul's habitation henceforth be safely built. He's saying only with this sort of depressing worldview, that's the only way that we can move forward. Richard Dawkins, another prominent anti-religious guy, said this. He says, the universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil and no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. He says, when you look out at the world, like the world's not looking back, right? He says, when you look at the universe, there's no purpose in that. It's all just sort of accidental. This is a certain kind of worldview, right? This is this naturalism, this saying that the natural world, the physical stuff, that's all there is. There's no God beyond that. There's no life after this physical life that we live. It's a worldview of naturalism. Now, the question then is like, is naturalism right? Is naturalism correct? Because if it is, then that means what we read in Genesis is not correct, right? If naturalism is true, then Genesis is not true. They can't both be true at the same time, because this is saying that God purposefully creates all of this, that God has purpose for the universe. But these guys are saying there isn't that. Well, a naturalistic worldview struggles to explain a lot of the things in our universe. Stephen Hawking is a famous scientist. He died just a few years ago. He died as a proclaimed atheist. But listen to what he said. He said, it would be very difficult to explain why the universe would have begun in just this way, except as the act of a God who intended to create beings like us. He's saying, I don't necessarily believe this, but when I look at the universe and I see how things seem to be created with function and purpose, and things are moving towards a certain end, animals, are giving birth to other animals, water and waves and oceans are doing their thing, and animals are living within that, and you see the weather, and you see all this doing what seems to be, what looks like it was designed to do. He says, it's hard to explain that unless there was a God who had that in mind. The intelligent design movement offers many critiques of that kind of worldview. There's a bunch of those back there that you can read on your own time. One of them is by a guy named William Lane Craig. He sort of made something famous called the Kalam cosmological argument. That's just sort of a big way of saying this. Everything that begins to exist has a cause. If something comes into existence, it doesn't just do that, like something causes it. The universe began to exist. Even the atheist scientists say the universe hasn't always been here. Like they point back and they say there was this, they call it the Big Bang. They say there was something that happened where not just material things came into existence, but time and energy and matter, all of this stuff came into existence in this instant. And at that point, you can go all the way back there, but to go before that takes a leap of faith for anybody, right? And so the scientist who says there's absolutely no God, they take a leap of faith when you say, well, so how did it start? Who was the one who not just knocked over the first domino, but who was the one who set the dominoes up in the first place? We say God did that. They say, well, we don't know what did that. And so if the universe has a cause, and if everything that begins to exist, of which the universe is one of those things, has a cause, then it means that something caused the universe to come into existence. Now, what would that be? Right? What could that be? If time itself comes into existence at that moment, then it has to be something or someone who's outside of time. Right? It can't be someone within the system, because the system doesn't exist yet. It's got to be someone outside of the universe who brings the universe into existence. Well, to do that is no easy feat. So not only do you have to be outside of time, you got to be pretty powerful. And it has to be something immaterial, because matter itself comes into existence at that time. And so you start to realize that's starting to sound a lot like what we call God. This immaterial, all-powerful, eternal being that brings forth everything. And I love this quote. Robert Jastrow is a well-known scientist, and look at what he says. He says, "For the scientist who has lived by his faith in the power of reason, the story ends like a bad dream. He has scaled the mountain of ignorance. He is about to conquer the highest peak, and as he pulls himself over the final rock, he is greeted by a band of theologians who have been sitting there for centuries." He says, look, what you guys are trying to explain is exactly what we've believed for hundreds and hundreds of years. That at the beginning of all of this, in the beginning, there was God. He predates all of this stuff, and he is the one who brings it into existence. And then it goes on to give this account of God, not just bringing stuff, because the ancient Hebrews didn't just care that things existed. They were like, why? Like, why is all of this here? Like, when you go out and you look at the mountains and you look at the sunset and you look at these things, do you ever ask that question? Not just, I wonder how this stuff sort of came to be. Like, I wonder how the mountains came to become mountains. I mean, those are interesting questions, but I think the deeper questions, the questions that the ancient Hebrews asked, was why? Why is this stuff here? Because it certainly doesn't have to be here. So how does this relate to Jesus? How does this ultimately point to Jesus? Well, John tells us in his gospel that Jesus, as the divine Son of God, was active at creation. This is a huge statement. And when he talks about the word, he's sort of using Greek terminology. The Greeks believed there was sort of this rationality, sort of this interesting kind of presence there, but they didn't really want to define it. They didn't want to say, oh, this was a person. Or it was more like there was this something out there. And what John is saying is no, like that word was a person. He says in the beginning, so he's echoing Genesis here. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And so when it says in the beginning God created, John is now saying in the beginning was Jesus, and he was there. So for people who say that the Bible just kind of claims that Jesus was just a moral teacher, like just kind of a traveling rabbi, what they wrote about him and what he accepted of people saying about him was far more than that. Because if that's not true, then that is big time heresy, right? To say, oh yeah, Jesus was there at the beginning at the creation of the world, would have been like, if that's true, that's awesome. If that's not true, then this guy's crazy. Like, if that's not true, like if Jesus wasn't there at the beginning of creation, then I mean, like, what would you say to someone like one of us if we started saying that? Hey, the Big Bang, like when all of this stuff started, guess who was there? like actually, I wasn't just there. Like, I was active in that. Like, I helped bring all of this into existence. You'd be like, I just got to make a phone call. You know? I mean, if one of us said that about ourselves, and we made claims, or if we let other people make claims about us like that, and we accepted those, and we're like, yeah, I'm not gonna disagree with that, then we would start to be like, and that's why C.S. Lewis said this. That's why you can't see Jesus as just a good teacher, because if he accepted things like this about himself, then is not really a good teacher. That would be crazy. You're like, a guy who thinks that he was there at the creation of the world, like, is few French fries short of a Happy Meal, right? And it's like, but if that's true, then that changes everything, right? If that's true about who Jesus is, then what does that mean when we talk about Jesus wanting to have a relationship with you? It means that we're not talking about some rabbi who taught for a while, did some cool things, and then sort of shuffled off the mortal coil like the rest of us into oblivion. We're saying, no, the guy that wants to know you, the guy that you read about in the New Testament is the one who is here, the one who is at the beginning. And that's a huge statement. Now, as with any statement, it can be true or not true, right? And the big question I want to throw out to you, and many of you may say, yeah, I believe that. I believe that's true. Some of you are maybe like, I don't know yet. Like I wanna look into that a little bit more. Some of you might be like I find that really hard to believe. Wherever you are on that spectrum, I would say this is one of the biggest questions you could ever ask, is if Jesus is that, if Jesus is there from the beginning, what does that mean? It means that he's got a pretty good understanding of the way the world works and your purpose within that world. It means that you're not an accident. Right? It means that you're not just some accidental outcome of this accidental process that has happened, and you're just sort of one of the lucky ones that survive. Right? It means that you have a place within this story. You have a place within this universe, and folks are sometimes like, well, why would God create this massive universe just to focus on humanity? Right, on this little planet, sort of third rock from the sun. Like, why does God care about us when you got this massive massive thing? And it's like, well, like why can't he? Sometimes it's like, well, like, can you imagine God's perspective of the universe? Like, what if the universe is in part brings glory to God because of how magnificent it is? And just because we will never see most of the universe, right, doesn't mean that it's not significant in God's in God's creation. And so we have to ask ourselves, the God who created this massive thing, this massive universe, if he wants to have a relationship with me, then what kind of love is that? What kind of love? Because when you start looking at how big the universe is, you can start feeling a little bit small. Be like, man, do I even matter? Like, in the big scheme of things, do I even matter? And yet, as we will continue to go through these in the next couple of weeks, what we'll find is that after God sets all this up, he says, I want to create people in my image. I want to create something that is different from the rest of creation, that will serve a different purpose, that I will come to know and be in relationship with in a different way than I'm in relationship with the rest of all of this stuff. That's an amazing thing that all of this leads to. And so I'm going to ask the band to come back up, and they're going to lead us in a time really just of a celebration and singing to this God. But as they come up, let me ask you, do you ever look at the natural world around you and find yourself brought to this sense of awe? Do you ever see the mountains? Right, one of my favorite drives is coming down Cedar Hill, or coming down Cabro Bay Road, like past the university and like Camosa College, all that stuff, and then you sort of crest a little bit. And if the clouds are gone, you there's that moment that you crest and you see the mountains. And it's also when you're coming from the airport and you're sort of coming to the outskirts of Victoria, and they knew when they put the sign there, welcome to Victoria, because it's like, mountains, welcome to Victoria. They're like, yeah, Victoria, man, check it out. And you crest that, and every time I'm driving someone from the airport, if you can see it, I'm sort of like, just wait, just check this out. Like, and what's funny is, like, that's not even Victoria, right? What you're saying isn't like, look at how awesome our city is. It's, look at the awesome view that we have from our city. Because the most amazing building that we've built in Victoria, not that it's a bad achievement, but it pales in comparison to those mountains on the horizon. Have you ever brought it to a sense of awe when you see that stuff? Do you ever look at that stuff and think like, man, I'm sort of fortunate that all of this accidental stuff was so beautiful to me? Like why don't we see the world like dogs do, right? Like, why don't we just sort of see things in black and white? Like why is the universe beautiful? Why are mountains beautiful? Why is the sunset beautiful? It doesn't need to be. Like, what purpose does that serve? Like, why isn't the sunset ugly, right? It's not, like, rocks aren't sitting there being like, wow, look at that. Like, but we do. We look at this stuff and we say, this is amazing, and what does it do in us? Do we say, wow, like, look at those atoms colliding and doing all this? Like, we say, like, brought to a sense of awe. And I want to thank somebody, or I want to worship, like, I want to sing, like, when you see some of that, and you're just like, why is it bringing out that sort of response in me? I think it's because that's the response it's designed to bring out in you. That when God creates all of this, it says, all of this declares my glory. Look at what the psalmist says. The heavens declare the glory of God, and the sky displays what his hands have made. It says when you look at nature, you're not just looking at a sort of a big accidental process that we just left out and it happens to be beautiful to us. It doesn't really serve a purpose, right? Things don't have to be beautiful to be functional, but it is beautiful. And it brings out a certain response in us that drives us to worship. When you go on a hike and you look at some of those views, and you're just like, why is this bringing out, like, you sort of like I feel like I want to sing, but like, who am I singing to? Am I singing to the mountains? Like, the mountains don't care. Am I singing to myself? I was like, no, like, why this response? Might it be that God created within us to respond in such a way as we live within this temple that he has created for his own glory, and as we are the caretakers of this, and we'll talk more about this next week, but as we live within what he has designed to bring himself glory, I think it makes absolute sense that we would be brought to a state of awe, because that's why this stuff exists. The heavens declare the glory of God, and you know what happens when we see the heavens opened up in a sunset? We declare the glory of God as well. And so we're living in not just a cold, dead universe. We're living within the creation of God that was put in place with a purpose in mind. And I would encourage you, the greatest thing you can do with your life is to ask yourself, God, how do I fulfill the purpose that you have created me for, so that I might live within your creation, among your creation, in a way that I was designed to do. And so these guys are going to lead us in a song, and in this song, we're singing about Lion and the Lamb. We're going to talk about some of that down the road. Why do we talk about Jesus as a lamb that was slain? We'll talk about that when we start talking about the sacrificial system in the Old Testament, how Jesus fulfills that, but it also talks about a lion. In the ancient world, the lion was like king of the jungle, right? When you talked about God being a lion, you're saying God who creates the world is no joke. Like, there's power behind that. If you've heard a lion roar, we saw some lions in Africa one time, and they like just did a little roar, just like roar, and like the whole place shook. And we're just like, there's power in that animal. It says God is he's meek. He sacrifices himself like this lamb, but he's also a lion. Because a God that can create what we see around us is a powerful God. And that God wants to know you. He wants to be in relationship with you. And so would you stand and let's sing this together. This song is declaring glory to the same God that the heavens declare glory to. And so as you sing, you give worship to the God who created you for that purpose.
He's coming on the clouds, kings and kingdoms stop the Lord Almighty? Who can 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 stop the Lord? Our God is the light of Judah, who's roaring with power and fighting our battles. Every knee will bow before Him. Our God is the Lamb that was slain for the sin of the world. His blood breaks the chains. Every knee will bow before the Lion and the Lamb. Every knee will bow before Him.
Thank you guys. You can have a seat for a moment. I'm gonna invite James share. When I read through Genesis, I'm amazed because it almost gives this picture of an artist putting all the pieces together of the world to create something beautiful. And so I think how amazing is it that the artist has invited some of his art, us, to know him. And so, James, why don't you share a little bit behind this?
Yeah, to me, God is just such an amazing artist, and I'm at awe so often when I think about what He's created, from what we can't see to what is so huge that we can't grasp it, so tiny that it yet so detailed in everything. And so this painting, it's sort of like the creation of man. These you might not be able to see, but this is supposed to look like DNA, and DNA is amazing. I mean, in every little cell is enough to fill like libraries of like books is written in every cell. And God designed us so amazingly, and He created us from the dust. So this is like a symbol of man that's grasping this leaf, and it's like an autumn leaf, and that leaf looks, I mean, it's just a simple leaf, but it's amazing in its design if you look at it close enough. And even though it's dying and it's fading away, God said, "Behold, I'm going to make all things new." And so this is like that temple that you were talking about in the back, that God created this world. It's like His design, His temple. And this temple is also reminiscent of the temple where they offered the sacrifices. And so it's like, almost like the blood coming down the sides of the stones, the bricks. And up here you have the universe. And what can we say? Jesus was there in the beginning. He was overseeing all of this creation, and yet He humbled Himself and became a man, became born as a baby, born to take on the sins of this world, so that unlike this leaf that fades away and dies and becomes dust again, that we could rise to life in the end of days and live with the Lord, the Creator, this great artist, this amazing. It's gonna be so awesome to know the Lord and to live with Him forever. This one who is designed, and this
excited to dig into this story because it's just the beginning of the story, saying God setting it all up, and the story plays out. And like any good story, there's some tragedy, there's some issues, but there's also some heroism, where the author himself enters into that story. The creator himself enters into his creation to save it. And so excited for things to come. Tonight, you're like, man, some of this was like a little high for me. That's okay. So tonight's a little bit more that way than the rest of them are going to be, just because a lot of what we'll hear, try to give you perspective here. That's not the perspective that you're always going to get, right? But the naturalism is really what's pervading much of our culture, and so oftentimes you're going to sort of be hit with like, man, we're just, this is kind of accidental. You just got to make your way. Like you just got to sort of figure out what it is that you like out of life and just go after that. That's completely at odds with what the Bible teaches us about. No, the one who put all this into existence did so for a purpose. And when you come to live within that purpose, it's an amazing, amazing thing. And so there's a lot of beauty around us in Victoria, and there's going to be that temptation to sort of worship the creation. And my suggestion and hope for us is let's always lift our eyes a little bit higher than that and say, hey, we're going to look at the painting and be like, man, that's an amazing painting. But you know what that makes me appreciate is the talents of the Creator. Appreciate James. I value my relationship with James more than I'll ever value my relationship with the painting, right? The amazing thing is that he was able to do that. It points back to him, and I think the universe does the same thing, pointing to the Creator. So why don't we stand together and actually, no. Before we stand, I invite Sarah up to share some things. Sorry, I'm on a roll. I'll let her do. She's way more interesting than I am. I'll let her do this, and then we'll close together.
So while James was sharing, it was impressed upon me to share with you. You may or may not know that every Sunday we have some children who participate in art throughout the room as well. And I just wanted to speak to those children and let you know that much like James uses the talent that God has given him to worship God through that talent, your art and what God is teaching you in here also glorifies God. And as I watch and observe the families that God is bringing and watching your children and what they are creating every week as they come, just know that it leads my heart to worship. And I am so grateful that you trust us with your families week after week. And so children, just know that God is at work in your life. And we believe that. And we believe that he has something for you every time you come here. And I see him at work in your life. And so just wanted to thank you for that. So that leads me to this envelope is on the seats around you. This envelope has a lot of purposes. One purpose of this envelope is if God is leading you to worship him through offering tonight, please use this envelope. You can fill it out and drop it in the offering box on the info table at the back. Appreciate that. And joining us in worshiping God in that way. Also, if you are a first-time visitor, if this is your first time here, we would love to meet you. So please fill out this card with just whatever information you're comfortable giving, name, email address, phone number, and bring it up here at the end of the night to exchange it for a free gift. Mike will be up here just to meet you personally and exchange this card. We really don't care about your information. We want to know you, and we want to be able to connect with you, and information is just a way that we do that. One major way that we do that is email. We have, I know emails, there's zillions. Every week, my email now sorts it like focus and other, and I love that because I'm like, who cares about the other? But we want to connect with you through email. It's just a great way to keep up to date with all the details and all the information that's going on. One of those things that you're going to receive more information about this week in your email is our hiking group is going hiking to Stewart Mountain, 1 o'clock on Saturday, February 1st. I did just a little bit of research. It's a moderate hike. It's a 3.9 kilometer loop, just to give you an idea of whether or not you feel like that's something that you would be able to do. Children are welcome. This past Saturday, the hiking group went on a walk, and my sweet little Everett joined in and just had the best time, just walking. And he loves you guys so much, and all the investing that you're doing in his life is so precious to us. So children are welcome. If that's something you feel like your family is capable of doing, they'd love to have you join in. So that's it for me for the announcements. I'd love.
Questions, talk to me.
Oh, talk to Brian, leader of our hiking group back there, if you have any questions. And maybe connect with him or Mike at some point this week if you're planning to join, so just so they know what to look out for you. So it'd be my pleasure to lead us in a word of prayer before we go. So let's pray. Dear Heavenly Father, I just thank you for each person in this room. They are a gift. They are a blessing. And God, we're just thankful for each individual personality that you created unique, with a purpose to glorify you in all that they do. God, I ask that you would plant a desire in each of our hearts to draw closer to you each day this week. God, those who don't know you, I ask that you continue to draw them closer and closer to yourself until you are in full relationship with them. We love you and ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen. Thanks for coming.